Marty, we'll turn to you first. So Nick just mentioned the SEC recently presented its framework on ESG disclosures and climate risk disclosures. Other bodies, for example, the International Sustainability Standards Board, also recently launched proposals. What are the key differences between those from your perspective?
Thanks, Nina. I'm going to start with how they're similar, because they're really similar. And I think that's a really good thing. These are global standards and we need them to be adopted by companies that work across the world. So they're both built on and structured on the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure recommendations. So they're organized around the same 4 core elements of governance, risk, strategy, and metrics and targets. They both adopt the same definitions of materiality. Again, another big win. They both require governance and risk management processes to be disclosed along the lines of the TCFD recommendations. They adopt the principles of the IASB and FASB, so the State on Decision Useful Information, so relevance, faithful representation, etc. The both approaches have decided not to mandate scenario analysis as a means of addressing strategic resilience. So that's also quite a big one. And both look for historical information to be reported alongside the current information to enable trend analysis. Now, differences is in the location. The location we specify.
Just explain to us TCFD for those.
Of course, my apologies. The TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This was set up by the G20 Financial Stability Board in 2015. And in 2017, they published a set of recommendations for how they saw climate being a financial risk and needed to appear in companies' accounts and reported as such going forward. So really elevated climate right up from sort of being in the back rooms and the silos and the comms marketing departments right up into finance and board level, but right up to the board, right up to the top, and asking it to be considered and linked to the accounts. Cool, right? So that's been the cornerstone of thinking on climate reporting for the last sort of 5 years. It is referenced in regulation or compliance with regulation around the world already. So it's a really good foundation for these two to build off, because there's lots of people are already doing it. There's a lot of market practice to build off. But there are, there's a few minor differences. One has assurance, one doesn't. We're agnostic on assurance, things like that. There's some small differences around things like scope 3, industry metrics. We have them, SEC doesn't. A few other smaller pieces along the side, but there's a lot of good alignment, and I think that is a good place to start from.
Carrie, what are your thoughts on the proposals as someone who will likely be in a position to have to apply them and comply with them at Splunk? What are your thoughts on the SEC and ISSB proposals?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. It's wildly exciting now that there's convergence and harmonization of what has traditionally been considered, voluntary disclosures, feel-good things. I've been in the standard space for 16 years, and in the last 2 years, there's been an incredible amount of movement consolidation around this. From an issuer's perspective, leading up reporting for Splunk, and for others in the past, really the challenge is to really be involved in public advisory, public commentary periods, keeping an eye for harmonization, and really underscoring what Marty said is, in general, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures really talking about the governance, strategy, risks and ops, metrics and targets, and those pieces are really foundational for how we provide decision useful information to the market. And I also feel that there are many things that are very similar rather than what the differences are, but those differences are from an issuer's perspective of looking at getting ready for this reporting is looking at sort of that agnostic piece of what are the disclosure pieces that are universal to everything. What is the sector-specific disclosures that are in these pieces? And then jurisdictional, what are the disclosures at a jurisdictional level? And then going down to materiality of what is financially material to your organization. So I think those are the key pieces. I think it's a little simpler than it seems. There's just a lot of movement going on right now, and everything is converging in terms of this piece of the convergence of the standards.
Marty, how's that from your perspective? What do you, at this point in time, and of course we're still in the early stages, companies and regulators are still going through the proposals. The SEC yesterday extended its comment period, given that it's a lot of paper to read through. From your perspective at this point in time, what do you think will be the most challenging parts for companies? And also, can we already say what is lacking in the proposals?
So I think both sets of proposals are very comprehensive. They're both going into new territory. So both sets of proposals, first and foremost, require everyone to comment and say what you think. The yes, the no's, they count, right? The yeses count as much as the no's, or do it differently, or the comments, because if you don't tell me in my consultation you like it, it might not stay. So it's really important that people get involved in these consultations and truly tell us what they think and tell us what would work for them if they don't like it. You know, what really works for them in the business, and I think that's absolutely critical. In terms of the convergence, that is, and the uncertainty for preparers, I think the best message I can give is if you currently use any of the frameworks and standards directed at enterprise value, around investor focused reporting, they will all be merging into the ISSB standards. So keep doing them while the ISSB standards merge out, because you're going to be best prepared to go forward and keep reporting. Once these things do become mandatory, that would be my advice. Don't stop, probably do more, but don't stop. But the other thing is there is an awful lot of this information already out there, just maybe not in companies, just not structured the same, maybe just not managed the same. And so there is a really good base for large listed companies, at the very least, to build off, to move forward, to comply with both the SEC and the ISSB standards once they come into force in a few years' time.
Carrie, you were just mentioning your experience with this topic, and of course it goes back a while. Splunk already has voluntary reporting of sustainability metrics. So I'm wondering, given that there's already years of voluntary work in this, how do we get to this place where you can easily adjust to mandatory reporting requirements, which will probably not entirely match what you've reported before? So how does that look at Splunk?
Thanks, Nina. I think my guidance, and based on my experience and my guidance for people who are looking at this, if you think of from an issuer's perspective, most likely on your financial reporting side, you already have a disclosure committee, you have disclosure standards, you have an internal audit function, you have all of those pieces for the financials, and you also have sort of the checks, the controls, and the SOX compliance. All of those pieces are in place. So my guidance to issuers is to take a look at how do you integrate ESG disclosures across the business. And so you look at your voluntary disclosures, take a look at these pieces, and really, to simplify it, just look at TCFD and SASB, because those are going to be sort of the underlying pieces, see where your gaps are, and then start to build those relationships across the shop with the financial accounting team, the internal audit team, your third-party audit team, and start to look at what you're voluntarily disclosing, what's material to your business, and start to fill in those gaps by running the voluntary disclosures through those internal processes. At Splunk, we really want to lead in our sustainability disclosures. We want to get in front of this. And one of our high-level objectives around ESG is business integration, and that's exactly kind of threading that across the shop. So I would say look at the existing processes that you have in place and start to look at what those gaps are with these pending disclosure regs and voluntary pieces, and start to fill in those gaps and try to work them through your existing quality control processes.
How is that, given that at the moment it's still the case that depending on where the company is in its sustainability journey, we were hearing earlier from Marty, sort of started out in marketing, then moved elsewhere, the responsibility for tracking this kind of data. So once there is a mandatory reporting requirement, where would this be based at Splunk?
I think for the voluntary and the regulated disclosure pieces, to me, what it looks like is a cross-functional working group, probably run through a company's disclosure committee, and having specialized people on the sustainability reporting side, and then also having those people who develop the proxy, the financials, internal audit, and third-party auditors. So to me, that is the model that looks to be the best way to position companies for doing their disclosure practices.
Marty, what are your thoughts on that?
We, unlike the SEC proposal at the ISSB, we actually specify that you need to list the body that's actually responsible for the disclosures. So whether that be the board, whether that be a specific committee, and it goes as far as asking for an individual. So this really needs to be, and I'm sure this is the case at Splunk, that any company that's leading in this, it's led from the top down. It's a full board sport, and it comes right down through the business and is integrated. And that's what makes it, because disclosure and reporting is really the last thing that happens, right? That's telling the story about all the good work that went on before and all the activity that went on before. So this really has to be, as Carrie said, a full organized, a full company-wide integrated process, because sustainability really should be business as usual, not something that's bolted on in various different parts of the business. So really to embrace it into existing functions is absolutely the right way to go forward.
Yeah, and I want to hop on to just really quickly what Marty said in my previous comment. It's implied, for me that it's absolutely board on down, and legal and corporate governance are across those as well.
Just coming back to the differences between the two standards, one key thing, as far as we at CFO Journal have reported, is that the SEC proposal is basically industry agnostic, whereas the ISSB one is specific and has delineations for 68 different sectors. What are your thoughts on those two different concepts here?
Well, some of that is down to the fact that one of the converging organizations is the Sustainability Standards Board into the IFRS Foundation, which immediately meant that we were absorbing the idea of industry-based metrics. So we'll be taking the SASB metrics, and they'll go through full consultation later this year to be internationalized and updated. And that is a good approach and a good way forward. I think it also, I never like to think they're the lowest common denominator, but they give companies, from my lens, that are new on this journey, an idea of where to start. They're really good for working out where you need to start, what would be most material to your sector from a sustainability perspective, and gives you a framework that sits above it then through the general requirements without any thematic standards to allow that to communicate that in a way that's useful for investors. So it's a good approach from there, and we also then can cover more issues actually that are more material for investors faster than if we can just through thematic standards.
Carrie, any thoughts on that? You're nodding.
Yeah, no, I'm nodding and agreeing with it. Is looking at the sector agnostic pieces, sort of the general disclosures and approach to materiality, the principles based pieces of these, and then going through jurisdictional pieces as well. In terms of disclosing to, for example, the UK streamlined energy and carbon reporting piece, which is in the filings. I think that came online last year. And so for the SECR, there are also very jurisdictional specific areas that may not tie up to the SEC or the ISSB, and those match the values and the commitments of that of that government, of the UK's net zero pieces. So that also kind of applies up. And I think it's important to look at the agnostic, the sector, the thematic, the jurisdictional, and to see what's material for your organization. So it is a lot to sort of rinse through to get to the disclosure piece. And there is some complexity to it, when you pull in the jurisdictional level as well.
Yeah. One thing that we've heard from companies here in the US so far is with regards to the SEC proposal, that companies are afraid of rising compliance costs because, of course, all these emissions not only have to be tracked and these risks have to be classified, but it also has to be in a way that stands basically an SEC reporting standard. Therefore, we've heard from companies that they fear that this might result in just higher costs. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, from an issuer's perspective, I look at it in terms of there are additional skill sets that need to come into this disclosure piece, and there's an emerging sort of cottage industry around greenhouse gas accounting and all of the consulting and all of that piece of it. I can't speak to the additional costs specifically, but I do know there's a report coming out that's co-sponsored by Cirrus, Persephone, and ERM about the speculating on what the additional costs are related to compliance for carbon accounting. But I can say it is risks are risks. And if this is, it's decision useful information, you know, as Gensler said a couple of weeks ago, you put the information out into the market and you let the investors decide what they're going to do. And so from an issuer's perspective, you have to put credible, timely, comparable data out there. I think the bigger issue is where are we going to find all of these, you know, overnight, full-blown greenhouse gas accounting professionals globally to meet this need. So there's also an upskilling and reskilling factor that keeps me up at night related to this.
Yeah, I was actually wondering if Mardi, given that Europe has been on the forefront of reporting climate data earlier than potentially other jurisdictions like the US, if it might be easier for companies to find these experts in Europe than, for example, here in the US, where we're facing this situation, as Carrie described, that it's just hard to find people who have these skills and can provide these kind of services to companies.
I want to say it's better here, but it's not. And that is because I think everyone, you know, for the last 10, 12 years, everyone's kind of just been sitting on the sidelines. Now, for the last 10 years, since 2010 in the US and equally over here, you're required to report risk to your market, full stop. You know, it hasn't been that you weren't supposed to do this. It's just that those enforcing it actually didn't know how to pick this up. And now, and I think where we're starting to see now is the enforcers are paying the money and getting, particularly in the UK, I know a good example, but here in Europe, they are recruiting. They're the ones paying the money to get the skill sets in so they can start to police these regulations that they're putting into place. We said that from a compliance perspective, we should be actually quite on top of. But there is, the skills gap is huge, and it cuts across all those departments in every organization that we've talked about. You know, it's upskilling everything from the board to the legal to auditors. Right, you know, it's going to be a company-wide sport to upskill on ESG. But in terms of the cost of compliance, now many companies do actually report to 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 current voluntary standards. There's a huge amount of harmonization and cutting down, quite frankly. You just need 2, your annual report and accounts are equivalent, and your sustainability general wider impact report, and any other communications you want to put out are your choice. But you actually aren't required to publish all these different reports that companies do republish now. So there's a chance for rationalization and to tell one story, which is better for the market and will help reduce costs, because the data you are collecting, you'll be able to maybe upfront invest, but over time, the systems will be in place and it actually should streamline and reduce costs. And also, increase the high quality data and also make it easier for investors to allocate capital to you to keep moving forward, if that's what you're after, if you are putting out that better information.
Yeah, you're bringing up an interesting thought. Of course, enforcement is going to be crucial to this, assuming that those standards become mandatory and companies start reporting these metrics as part of their regular disclosures. Do you think, Carrie, that this is exposing companies to additional legal risks, given that this is going to be something that will be enforceable going forward?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball and I'm not an attorney. I have been tracking some of the conversations and the commentary around the SEC public advisory piece first, and that is the chatter and the noise is a lot of this will be in litigation for a long time. And I think that distracts from what the urgency of the issue about climate change, of all in on this transition to help to reduce the most severe impacts of climate change. So yes, I'm sure there will be litigation around this. And again, I'm not an attorney. I don't have a crystal ball, but I would be surprised if there wasn't. And at the same time, that is, there is a distraction between what we're really trying to do is transform to a low carbon economy and translate our risks to the market so they can understand where they want to put their money. And that's the bigger picture. I don't think this is going away, and I don't think it'll get delayed or deferred. And if it does, you still have the onus to disclose that, whether it's in a voluntary or regulated publication.
And I think the investor pressure is going to be greater than ever, isn't it, Carrie? I think business will feel the investor pressure if we don't, if the rule gets caught up in regulation, in litigation in the US. I think it is you are going to see bottom up. You'll see companies, large global companies, being asked by their investors to start using the ISSB standards, given they're so close. And you will start to see that bottom up. A bit like we have already for climate in the US, that the companies are actually, flying ahead in terms of their good work in this space.
Yeah, you're right, Marty. Sorry. Just to put a sort of another yes and on that is, I'm thinking about the Climate Action 100 plus, investor piece, and also say on climate, which is as similar to say on pay. It'll start to get traction on this.
Yeah, we'll go to audience questions in a minute and return to Nick. That was actually one thing, Marty, that I wanted to ask you about. So if the SEC proposal doesn't really make it to light, sort of, is the assumption then that there's going to be more pressure for companies just to follow the ISSB proposal and standard by then?
I can't put words in the SEC's mouth, but it does provide a global framework, which we are expecting to be adopted in other leading markets around the world. And if US companies are working with those jurisdictions, then they'll be asked to be doing that framework. So, I think given they are very, very similar, I think everyone should be looking to start doing something along those lines pretty quickly. Just so also the cost of compliance then is lowered, right? If you start now, if you haven't started, just starting now with a couple of year leading will help you, start to think and get it in place before, you have to go wrap right up overnight and spend all the money. So get started now would be my advice.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'll hand it over to Nick. He's going to have some questions from the audience for you guys.
Thanks, Nina. Question about data. So it's widely acknowledged that the quality of sustainability data leaves a lot to be desired. Does that become more of a problem if companies are required to report that data to regulators? Carrie, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first sort of thing that comes to mind are Scope 3 emissions, which are wildly difficult to really get down. But data is important. Data is at Splunk, we are a data company where everything we do is data driven, and it is important to get the data right so that you can take an inference on what that data is telling you. So regardless of how difficult it might be to get accurate data, there are some things that you can do at the top of the hour. I said, run it through your disclosure committee, have your disclosure standards, put your controls around that data, bring in your internal audit, and start to really look at that at an early stage. So your direct emissions, your purchased power, all of that is pretty straightforward. It's the upstream and downstream emissions related to things like business commuting, things like that are going to be difficult, but do the best that you can. Be very clear, foot your information where your assumptions and methodologies are, follow leading practices for, climate accounting. And that's sort of that piece on the data. The data has to be right. It's supposed to be decision useful for the market.
Marty, do you see any emerging best practice when it comes to the data and how to improve it?
It's a good question. It's a question we get asked every single day. It's best practice in data. Honestly, I don't think anyone's completely cracked it yet. I think those that are using their existing systems are the ones that are doing it best. So where I see large global companies are the ones where they're embedding it into their existing practice, seem to have the best handle on it, or really small companies where, again, it's sort of been prioritized from the beginning. And so again, designing in early is a way to get that better quality data out, and hopefully things like digital tagging of data will also help over time to improve it and help it move more efficiently across the business and not get lost along the way.
Question about investors and the information they're requesting. Do you see a convergence between the sorts of requests that companies are receiving from investors and the sorts of information they will be required to report to regulators? Carrie, what do you think about that?
Well, generally, the general questions that investors ask are related to DE&I, human capital management, climate, generally around those areas, some areas around social impact, purpose, and those are those are very much top of mind because those translate into business value. They translate into attraction and retention issues, and general satisfaction around the corporation, and also a management of how you're managing your people and your climate risks. I see no real variance between the standards that are coming through right now and what the focus are thematically with SEC, climate, human capital management. Our key issues with ISSB and also with the European standards, those are all covering the relative areas. So there is a general alignment based on those two.
And Mardi, thoughts on that question?
Just to say that we set our standards based on investor demand. So we really look to what their information they need and set the standards that align with that. And so although we've started with climate as our first thematic standard, there'll be an agenda consultation later this year, be asking the market, hey, what should we do next? What's our next theme? Are we going down a route of D&I? Are we going down the route of another human capital? Are we going down biodiversity? Are we doing water? What do the investors need next, and in what order? Very much to continue to drive this decision useful information and better quality data out.